She opened her eyes to silence, and the only thing that knew her name was a dog with dying eyes. A woman at a gas station screamed and hugged her, whispering, "You saved my son," but she didn't even flinch. Everywhere she walks, strangers break down, holding letters, photos, and tears, and still, her memory is a locked, dark room. The dog begins leading her across towns, unlocking lives she never remembers living and promises she doesn't recall making. Then she sees a photograph she doesn't remember taking, of a baby she doesn't remember having, beside a grave with her name. Young nurse Emily couldn't know that the old woman she cared for once saved her father's life in a war hospital. Tommy never realized that his quiet devotion was what kept her soul anchored through years of wandering. And Lillian, broken by years of forgetting, certainly had no idea she was walking straight into her child's arms 50 years too late. It all began with the smell of burnt toast on a Tuesday morning, the kind of smell that once reminded her of breakfast after Sunday service, when her husband would hum Johnny Cash while flipping eggs with a fork and a grin. But this time, the smoke alarm screamed into the empty kitchen like it was announcing something nobody wanted to hear, and Lillian just stood there, holding a cold butter knife, trying to remember who she had meant to make breakfast for. The dog, her German shepherd, old and gray around the snout, trotted in with the steady gait of someone used to doing all the watching. He tilted his head, looked her in the eyes, and in that moment, she realized she couldn't remember his name. She knew it started with an M, maybe Max, or Milo, or something else altogether, but saying it out loud felt like picking a stranger's name out of a hat. She sat down on the edge of the sofa, toast forgotten, smoke lingering, heart thudding slow like a tired metronome. The photographs on the mantel stared back at her, people she recognized only by the shape of their smiles and the way her heart seemed to twitch when she looked at them too long. Names swam just beyond her reach. She whispered, "What is happening to me?" but the only answer was the low whine of the dog resting his head on her knee. By noon, she had packed a small satchel, one sweater, 2 photographs, a tin of butterscotch candies, and left the house without locking the door, though she couldn't have told you why. The dog followed, as he always did, no leash, no hesitation, as if he knew something she didn't and had known it for some time. He nudged her gently down the path behind the house, the one they used to walk after supper, back when she could name every tree by its bark and every star by its place in the sky. The path led to a fence, then to an old gravel road, the kind with grass growing in the middle and tire ruts deep enough to twist an ankle. Lillian paused, not sure where she was going or why her feet kept moving forward, but the dog pressed on ahead, looking back every few steps like a guide who refused to speak. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th turn, a weathered sign appeared, half covered in ivy, the paint nearly worn away, Hillgrove School, EST 1932. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her lips parted slightly, and a flicker passed behind her eyes like someone had lit a match in a forgotten room. She reached out, touching the sign as if it might spark something more, something bigger. The dog sat beside her and waited, as still as an old soldier standing watch. The schoolhouse door was unlocked, creaking open with a kind of dignity, as though it remembered who she used to be. The hallway smelled like chalk and waxed floors, just like it had 50 years ago when she'd stood here holding a stack of spelling tests and wearing a dress that now hung, long forgotten, in the back of her attic closet. And then came the voice. A woman, not much younger than Lillian, stepped from a classroom doorway with a soft gasp. "Mrs. Hargrave? Is that really you?" she said, tears welling before her smile could catch them. Lillian blinked, trying to read the name behind the woman's face. Something stirred in her chest, something familiar but faint, like a radio signal from far away. "Did you say Hargrave?" she asked slowly, her hand resting on the dog's back. The woman stepped closer, her voice cracking. "It's me, Dana. You changed my life here, Mrs. Hargrave. Do you remember what you told me that day after the spelling bee?" Lillian's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the photograph in her pocket, the one with the little girl holding a ribbon. She looked into Dana's eyes, searching the past for the answer, and then, softly, she asked, "What did I say to you, Dana?" Dana took a step forward, her hands trembling like leaves on a late October branch, and with a voice soft from time but strong with memory, she said, "You told me that no ribbon, no trophy, no applause would ever mean as much as the belief we carry inside ourselves." Her words floated in the dust-speckled sunlight of the old school hallway, and Lillian felt something stir deep inside her chest, something like the first crack in a winter lake just before the thaw, subtle but undeniable. She watched Dana's eyes, watched the way they welled with years of unsaid gratitude, and for a moment she wanted to say something wise, something meaningful, but all that came out was a whisper, "That sounds like something I might have said." Dana chuckled, wiping the corners of her eyes with the edge of her cardigan sleeve, then turned toward the classroom and motioned gently with her hand. "Come inside," she said, her voice thick with something between invitation and hope. "There's something you need to see." Inside, the classroom looked nearly the same as it did half a century ago, as if time had tiptoed around it, too respectful to touch what mattered. The desks had changed, sure, but the bulletin board still held faded stars and the faint ghost of children's handwriting, and in the far corner sat a dusty wooden cabinet that Lillian recognized instantly, even if she couldn't name it right away. Dana walked to it, opened the drawer, and pulled out a scrapbook bound in worn leather. She laid it gently on the teacher's desk, the one that used to be Lillian's, and opened it to a page with a photograph, a little girl, no older than 8, holding a dictionary in one hand and a crumpled tissue in the other, her eyes wide and scared. "That was the day I lost the bee," Dana said, touching the image with fingers that looked too old to belong to that child. "I spelled perseverance wrong and cried in front of the whole school." Lillian stared at the picture, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if memory had started to bloom behind a locked door. "You cried," she repeated slowly, the word feeling strange on her tongue. "And I said something to you, didn't I?" Dana nodded and smiled, a smile full of forgiveness and admiration. "You sat beside me while the others left, and you told me that the spelling didn't matter, not really. You said what mattered was the courage it took to stand up and try again." Lillian looked away, out the window where the dog sat patiently in the yard, watching the breeze stir the branches like a lullaby. She didn't remember the moment, not fully, but something inside her responded to it just the same. It was like hearing a lullaby from childhood, familiar even when the lyrics were gone. "You were the first adult who ever made me feel like I was more than just a grade or a mistake," Dana said, her voice breaking now. "That day changed the way I saw myself." The scrapbook fell closed with a soft thud, and for a long while, neither woman said a word. The old building seemed to sigh around them, as if grateful for the silence. Then Lillian spoke, her voice low and even, "If I meant so much to you back then, why didn't I remember you when I saw your face today?" Dana placed a hand gently over Lillian's. "Because, Mrs. Hargrave, it's not just your memories that are fading," she said carefully. "There's something happening, isn't there? Something more than just forgetting a name." Lillian nodded slowly, her eyes misting but not spilling. "Sometimes," she said, "it feels like pieces of me are floating away, like letters on a page being erased by time." Dana took a breath, deep and measured, like someone bracing for a storm. "Then maybe," she said, "you don't need to chase the memories. Maybe they need to come find you." Outside, the dog barked once, sharp and clear, like the ringing of a bell in a quiet chapel. Lillian looked toward the door, a question forming in her heart before it reached her lips. "Where is he taking me next, Dana?" Dana paused, looked down the old hallway, then whispered like it was a sacred truth. "To a place where someone is still waiting to say goodbye." "To a place where someone is still waiting to say goodbye," Dana had said, and those words lingered in Lillian's ears like the slow toll of a distant church bell, echoing long after the sound had faded. She stepped outside with care, each footfall deliberate, as if the gravel beneath her boots might remember who she used to be better than she could. The dog stood up immediately, tail wagging not with excitement but with the steady purpose of a guide who knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, yet believed in the journey all the same. Lillian didn't ask where they were going, there was no need to speak, not when the dog already knew the path, not when the wind itself seemed to lean in and listen. They walked past hayfields long gone golden, past mailboxes leaning on their last nail, past things that had stood still while everything else moved on without warning. After what felt like an hour, they reached a long, winding drive half covered in creeping vines, the mailbox rusted shut and the paint on the old wooden gate peeling like sunburnt skin. But when Lillian saw the porch, wide, white, and sagging just a bit at the corners, something inside her shifted, like an old photograph finally slipping into focus. She stopped just before the steps, her breath catching not from the walk but from something older, deeper, buried beneath the years like a keepsake under floorboards. This was, she whispered, reaching out to touch the railing, my sister's house. The dog gave a low, encouraging bark, and she stepped onto the porch, her hand running along the same wood they'd painted together when they were girls, giggling over stolen popsicles and who would marry first. She knocked once, twice, out of habit more than hope, and waited. The door opened slowly, and there stood a woman no older than Lillian herself, thin and hunched, with hair the color of moonlight and eyes like mirrors, eyes that didn't smile at first, only studied. Then came the voice, as cracked and beautiful as an old record. "I thought you were gone," the woman said, leaning on the screen door like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Lillian blinked, emotions swirling in the dusty corners of her chest. "I thought I was too." They sat together in the kitchen, the one that still smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar, the one where laughter had once lived like a houseguest that never paid rent. They didn't speak much at first, just sipped warm tea in chipped mugs and stared out the window where the dog lay curled on the grass, as calm as a prayer. Then her sister, Anna, placed a small tin box on the table. "You left this here the night you walked out," she said, sliding it forward slowly. "That was almost 40 years ago." Lillian opened the lid with trembling fingers and found letters inside, letters she'd written but never mailed, apologies penned in midnight ink, regrets folded into corners, names she hadn't said aloud in decades. "I don't remember writing any of this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Anna nodded, her own eyes glassy. "You didn't have to remember. I remembered for both of us." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the kettle hissing on the stove, and the faint ticking of the old wall clock that had watched over their childhood. Then Lillian reached across the table, took her sister's hand, and held it like it was the only thing tethering her to the world. "I was so angry that night," Anna said quietly. "But I waited here every Sunday for years, hoping maybe the dog would show up first." Lillian smiled through the ache. "Well, he found me in the end, didn't he?" Anna looked at her and nodded, but her voice shook when she asked. "Why now, Lillian? Why come back after all this time?" Lillian didn't answer at first, not because she didn't want to, but because the words came slowly now, like autumn leaves falling from a stubborn tree, one at a time, in their own season. She looked down at her hands, older than she remembered them being, mapped with lines that whispered stories she had forgotten, and then back at Anna, whose eyes still held that same defiant kindness from childhood, the kind that had once stood between Lillian and a belt meant for punishment. "I came back," she said finally, her voice low but steady, "because something inside me kept saying that I had left too many doors closed for too long, and one of them had your name carved into it." The dog barked softly outside, more a hum than a warning, as though agreeing with her choice but gently reminding her that time was still moving, still ticking, still burning away like a log in a fireplace long after the fire was out. Anna sighed, leaned back in her chair, and let her gaze drift to the photographs lined along the kitchen wall, some of their parents, now long gone, some of Anna's grandkids, whose names Lillian couldn't quite remember but whose eyes seemed strangely familiar. "You know," Anna said softly, "I kept that guest room made up for 37 years. Fresh sheets every spring. Just in case." Lillian felt the tears gathering but didn't let them fall, not because she didn't feel them, but because she'd learned a long time ago that tears were sacred things, not to be spent casually. "Did you ever stop waiting?" she asked, her voice barely carrying across the table. Anna smiled with a kind of tired grace that only older women truly master. "I stopped believing in fairy tales," she said, "but I never stopped believing in you." They sat in silence for a while after that, letting the quiet fill the spaces that once held arguments, laughter, and the kind of apologies that never made it out of the throat. Later that afternoon, they walked out to the garden together, slow and careful, their steps matching in rhythm even after all those years apart. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the overgrown rows of marigolds and tomatoes that had gone wild without anyone to tend them. Anna stopped beside the fence and pointed toward the old toolshed, still standing somehow, though time had tried its best to bury it in weeds and rust. "You left something else behind," she said, her voice distant now. Inside the shed, tucked beneath a faded tarp and a box of broken mason jars, was an old rocking chair, the one their father built by hand, the one Lillian had always claimed as hers when they were girls playing house. She touched it gently, and in an instant, something came back, not a full memory, not a name or a date, but a feeling. That feeling you get when someone reads you a story before bed and promises you everything will be okay, even when it won't be. Anna was watching her, eyes soft, hands folded. "You never got to say goodbye to him," she said. "But you came back to the chair." Lillian nodded, finally letting the tears fall, each one carrying something unspoken away from her soul. As the sky turned that quiet shade of lavender that only shows up when you've had a good day and a hard one, Anna looked over and asked the kind of question that doesn't sound important until you realize it changes everything. "Do you remember what happened after the funeral?" Lillian turned to the horizon where the last sliver of sun dipped behind the trees, as if hiding from what was about to be said, and her fingers curled slightly over the worn arm of the old rocking chair, anchoring herself to something real, something unshakable. "No," she said finally, after a silence so thick it felt like a blanket too heavy for summer, "I don't remember much about the days after Daddy died, just fragments, like someone tore the pages out of a book and left them scattered across the floor of my mind." Anna looked down at the garden soil crusted into her shoes and nodded slowly, not surprised by the answer, as if she had been expecting it all along. "You left before they lowered him into the ground," she said, her voice wrapped in the gentlest kind of ache, "drove off in that blue Buick with your suitcase half-zipped and a letter in your coat pocket." Lillian blinked hard, as though the name Buick alone had stirred something dusty and painful in the corner of her mind, but no picture came, just a feeling, like regret with a cold wind behind it. Anna reached into the folds of her cardigan and pulled out a folded sheet of yellowed paper, the corners soft from age, the ink faded to a color somewhere between grief and time. Mama found it 2 days later, behind the sewing machine, just sitting there like it had been waiting for someone brave enough to read it. Lillian took the paper with hands that trembled not from weakness, but from recognition, her fingers remembering the weight of that page even if her mind could not. She unfolded it slowly, almost reverently, and began to read aloud in a voice she didn't entirely recognize as her own. "Anna, I don't know how to say goodbye to someone I blamed and loved in equal measure. Daddy was never easy on me, and I wasn't easy on him, but somewhere in all the shouting and silence, I know he meant to teach me strength. I just wish he'd left room for softness, too. If I leave now, it's not because I don't care, it's because I care too much, and I'm afraid that staying will make it worse. Maybe one day you'll understand. Maybe one day I'll come back. Love, Lil." When she finished, the paper slipped from her hands like a bird too tired to fly. For a moment, neither woman moved, both held in the quiet by the weight of everything unspoken between them. Anna leaned closer, placed a hand on her sister's arm, and said quietly, "You never got to know what happened after you left. Mama cried every night for a month, and then she stopped cooking, stopped writing her letters, stopped setting the table for 4. It was like something broke in her that none of us could fix." Lillian felt her chest tighten with the kind of sorrow that comes not from one choice but from years of them piled like snow against a door never opened. "Did she forgive me?" she asked, the words catching like thorns. Anna looked away for a moment, then back, her eyes glassy but strong. "She never said it out loud, but she kept your room exactly the same until the day she died. I think that was her way." The rocking chair creaked beneath Lillian as the wind shifted, bringing with it the faint scent of lilac, Mama's favorite flower, and something else, something deeper. A whisper of unfinished stories. The dog stood up, stretched, and gave a low growl, not one of anger, but of intention. He was ready to move again. Lillian stood slowly, her bones stiff but her spirit steadier than it had been in years. "I think it's time," she said softly, brushing the last of the soil from her hands. Anna followed her to the gate, and just before they parted, she asked in a voice still holding the echo of childhood secrets and midnight whispers. "Where will he take you next, Lillian?" "He's taking me to someone who never knew how much I loved him," Lillian replied, her voice steady now, touched with something stronger than memory, conviction. She didn't look back as she walked away from her sister's garden, only forward, her feet sure on the gravel path, the dog beside her with the quiet patience of an old train conductor guiding the final passengers home. The day stretched long, the way certain days do when time stops following its usual rules and starts obeying the heart instead. They traveled along back roads lined with cornfields and broken fences, where windmills creaked like ghosts trying to remember the sound of laughter. With every mile, Lillian felt both closer to something and further from everything she thought she'd left behind. Eventually, they came to a roadside diner that looked like it hadn't changed since Eisenhower was in office. The neon sign buzzed like a tired insect, and the front window held a hand-painted banner that read, "Open, pie by the slice." The dog nudged her gently toward the door, and she stepped inside with a sense of déjà vu so strong it made her pause just beyond the threshold. The bell above the door chimed, and the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee wrapped around her like a familiar quilt. A man behind the counter, white-haired but spry, looked up from wiping a mug and gave her a long, measured stare, the kind that reaches past skin and bone, digging into the soul. He set the mug down slowly and walked around the counter, one hand resting lightly on his hip as though bracing for something. "You're Lillian Hargrave," he said, the name falling from his lips like a stone dropped in deep water. She nodded, uncertain whether she should know him, but already suspecting that she did. "And you are?" The man's smile was a strange blend of sadness and relief. "Tommy Mason," he said, offering a hand that trembled just enough to reveal its honesty. "We used to drink coffee together at this very counter every Thursday at 4 o'clock. You probably don't remember that, do you?" Lillian furrowed her brow, reaching back into the fog of her memory, trying to grasp something solid. "I'm sorry, I don't." Tommy didn't seem hurt, only nodded, like a man who had waited a long time for a moment that wasn't his to define. He motioned to the booth by the jukebox, and she followed, sliding into the worn leather seat like it had been waiting for her all these years. He placed a single slice of lemon meringue pie in front of her and then sat across from her without touching his own coffee. "I don't need you to remember," he said gently. "But I want you to know that I loved you once, quietly, completely, and without asking for anything in return." Lillian stared at the pie, then at him, unsure whether to smile, cry, or simply disappear into the moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice smaller now, like a child's. "Because you were married," Tommy said, his voice calm but laced with the ache of roads never taken. "And because I knew you loved your husband, even on the days when you forgot how to show it." She closed her eyes, and in that stillness, a memory surfaced, faint but vivid, a conversation by the coffee station, his hand brushing hers as she reached for the cream, both of them pretending the electricity between them was just static from old sweaters. "I think I loved you too," she said, surprising even herself with the truth of it. "In my own way. I just didn't know what to do with it." Tommy smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "You did enough just by sitting here with me now," he said. "Some loves don't need to be lived to be real." The jukebox clicked to life suddenly, unprompted, playing a tune neither of them had heard in decades, a soft country ballad with a voice like smoke and longing. Lillian looked at him across the table, tears forming but not falling, and asked the question she had never dared ask when it mattered. "Why didn't you ever try to stop me from walking away?" Tommy took a long breath, one of those deep, measured breaths a man only takes when he's about to tell the kind of truth that's been burning a slow hole through his chest for half a lifetime. He looked out the window for a moment, eyes tracing the horizon like he was searching for something that had already left town years ago. "I didn't try to stop you," he said finally, his voice steady but weighed with quiet sorrow, "because some goodbyes are never about letting someone go, they're about loving them enough to let them leave on their own terms. Lillian sat back in the booth, feeling the truth settle deep inside her, not as a wound but as an explanation long overdue, like a letter that had taken decades to find its destination. The jukebox song faded, but the silence that followed was soft, like a blanket pulled gently over something too fragile to face the cold. "I used to light a candle in the front window every Thursday night," Tommy said, almost to himself. "Left it burning until just after midnight, thinking maybe, just maybe, you'd come back and see it." She didn't speak, but she reached across the table and took his hand, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. They weren't old, weren't burdened, weren't tired from years of loving too quietly, they were simply two people holding hands in a diner, with pie between them and the past behind them. He smiled, eyes twinkling like an old lantern, and added, "I only stopped lighting it 5 years ago. That's when I figured maybe it was time to let you go in peace." Outside, the dog stood up and walked slowly to the door, pawing once, then sitting, eyes fixed on the road like it had somewhere else to be, and like it was waiting on them to finish what needed saying. Lillian squeezed Tommy's hand, then let go, her fingers lingering for a heartbeat too long before falling away. "I don't know if I'll remember this tomorrow," she said honestly, "but I'll know I was loved today. And that means more than you can imagine." Tommy nodded, his voice too thick to answer. He walked her to the door, held it open as if it were a sacred duty, and watched her step out onto the sun-warmed concrete like someone who had just laid a burden down for the last time. The dog began walking again, steady and sure, and Lillian followed, her steps lighter now, not because she had found everything she lost, but because she had found enough to keep going. They passed through a field where the air smelled like honeysuckle and cut grass, and the silence between her and the dog was the kind that only comes from deep understanding. Then, in the distance, she saw it, an old VA hall with chipped paint and flags fluttering wearily in the wind, the kind of place that held more memories than furniture. Her pace slowed, and the dog paused, waiting for her to catch up. She looked down at him, her breath catching slightly. "You're taking me to someone else now, aren't you?" The dog gave no answer, only turned and started walking again, straight toward the entrance, where the door stood open and a figure waited inside. As Lillian stepped toward the building, she glanced down at the photograph in her coat pocket, one she didn't remember placing there, but that felt familiar in a way only truth can be. The man in the photo wore a uniform, smiled with a kind of pride that didn't need words, and behind him stood a row of flags, just like the ones fluttering in the wind ahead. She turned to the dog, her voice trembling now. "Was he one of mine?" "Yes," came the voice from just beyond the doorway, deep and weathered by time, like the creak of an old porch swing in late November. "I was one of yours, Miss Hargrave. One of the lucky ones." Lillian stepped into the hall with cautious reverence, each step echoing across the wood floor like a slow heartbeat. The room smelled faintly of polished brass, folded flags, and the kind of dust that gathers on photographs people are too afraid to throw away. The man standing in the center of the room was tall, though age had taken some of his height, and his uniform bore medals that shimmered like old secrets. His face was worn, his hair thin, but his eyes, those eyes, held a fire that time hadn't dared dim. "I don't," Lillian began, but he raised a hand gently, not to hush her, but to spare her from the weight of apology. "You wouldn't remember me," he said with a soft smile. "But I remember you. I was 19, fresh from basic, shaking in my boots and too proud to ask for help." She watched him, trying to chase the memory back into view, like a child chasing fireflies with a glass jar and no lid. "You came to the hospital in '71, he continued, stepping forward just enough to let the sunlight catch the picture in his hand, an old photo of her standing beside a hospital bed, a young man grinning despite the bandages. "You were volunteering. I'd lost 2 fingers and a whole lot of hope. And then you walked in with that lemon cake and said, 'Don't you dare feel sorry for yourself. Real men rise slower, but stand longer.'" The line hit her like a bell rung from deep inside, and something clicked, not a memory, but the shape of one, like the shadow of a tree you can almost name. "I baked a lot of cakes," she said slowly, her voice almost shy. You baked for all of us, he replied, laughing gently. But that one, you brought to me. You sat with me while I cried like a child, told me about your husband, your brother, the ones who came back wrong and the ones who didn't come back at all. She nodded slowly, feeling the echo of those nights, the aching backs, the late buses, the smell of disinfectant and cigarette smoke, and how every face had felt like someone else's child. I stayed alive because of you, the man said, voice tight now, hand gripping the photograph like a lifeline. I got married, had 3 daughters, and every one of them knows your name. I told them they wouldn't be here if it weren't for a woman who brought lemon cake and no nonsense. Lillian smiled through a sting in her eyes, the kind that only truth can bring. She stepped forward and placed a hand gently on his chest, right over the medals, as if to honor something far beyond war. You were always meant to make it, she said softly. All I did was remind you. He took her hand and bowed slightly, not as a soldier to a superior, but as a man to the person who gave him a second chance at being one. They sat for a time in quiet reflection, the dog lying at their feet like a sentinel. And when it came time to go, the veteran walked her to the door, his gait slow but proud. Before you go, he said, reaching into his jacket, there's something else I want to give you. He handed her a small velvet box, worn at the corners. Inside was a single gold button, the kind worn on military dress coats, but it was missing its thread, as if it had been waiting to be sewn back where it belonged. I saved it for 50 years, he said. I think it's time it found its way home. She closed the box slowly, holding it like something sacred. Then, quietly, she asked. Who told you where to find me today? The veteran smiled softly, the kind of smile that doesn't rise quickly but is drawn out from someplace honest, slow, and deep-rooted, like molasses poured in the winter. He motioned toward the end of the porch, where a man sat quietly beneath a rusted flagpole, his posture relaxed but his presence oddly commanding, like someone who knew how to disappear into silence without ever being forgotten. He told me where to find you, the veteran said, nodding toward the figure. Came by 2 weeks ago. Said it was time I finally gave you back what I owed. Lillian squinted, the sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground, and studied the man at the edge of the porch. He wasn't young, but he didn't wear the years the way others did. His hands were clasped in front of him, his head bowed slightly, as though lost in prayer or deep memory. She stepped toward him, the dog trailing quietly behind her, and stopped a few feet away, unsure if she should speak or wait to be spoken to. The man lifted his head, and when he did, she felt something tighten inside her chest, something more than recognition, something closer to reckoning. His face was familiar, not from photographs or holidays, but from the way a person carries your own features in their own. He had her eyes, the same sharp crease between the brows, the same slightly downturned mouth when lost in thought. You knew my name, she said slowly, each word heavy with the weight of years unaccounted for. He nodded once, then spoke in a voice that was quiet but filled with gravity, like water dripping steadily through stone. I've always known your name, he said. You're my mother. The words didn't crash into her, they slid beneath her skin, past the soft spots of confusion, past the years of forgetting, straight into the marrow of who she used to be. Her knees buckled slightly, not from shock, but from the weight of a truth too long buried. I was born in 58, he continued, his tone patient, gentle, the way one speaks to a woman standing on the ledge between memory and forgetting. You gave me up when I was 6 weeks old. They said you were young. Alone. Not ready. She sat down beside him on the bench, the air suddenly too thick, her throat too dry. She wanted to say something, anything, but no words came, only a sound, small and helpless, like a bird hitting a window. I was raised by good people, he went on, looking out at the horizon rather than at her. Had a good life. But I always wondered why. Why I wasn't enough. Why I had your eyes but not your voice. Lillian reached for his hand, slow and uncertain, and he didn't pull away. His fingers closed around hers, and in that simple grip, something shifted, like a door creaking open in a house thought long abandoned. I was afraid, she whispered. Afraid that I couldn't love you the way you deserved. And when the time came to face it, I ran. I spent years trying to find you, he said, his voice breaking just slightly. And when I did, I waited. I waited for the right moment. For when you might remember me, not just my face, but what we shared, even if it was brief. I don't remember, she said, and the pain of that admission felt like a betrayal. But I do, he replied, his grip tightening slightly. And I remembered for both of us. They sat like that for a while, under the heavy hush of a sun beginning to set, the dog lying quietly at their feet, tail thumping now and again, as if pleased to have delivered them at last. Lillian looked at her son, not the boy she never held long enough, but the man he'd become despite her absence, and asked, her voice cracking gently at the edges. Why now? Why come to me when I'm this far gone? Because, he said, turning toward her with a gaze that held no resentment, only the soft ache of time recovered, I needed you to see, even if only once, what your life had left behind, what your love, however broken or buried, had managed to plant and grow in places you never saw. Lillian looked down at her hands, resting now in his, and they no longer trembled. They were still worn, still lined with years, but they were calm, like riverbanks after the flood has passed. She looked up at her son, this man who should have been a stranger, but now felt more like the final chapter of a story she'd long stopped believing she was worthy to finish. I don't remember enough, she said softly, her voice carrying the tired weight of truth. There are whole decades I can't find anymore. I don't know how to carry what I've missed. You don't have to carry it, he replied gently, brushing a leaf from her shoulder. You just have to let yourself be part of it. Right now. While you still can. The dog stood suddenly, ears perked, tail low, and stepped forward between them. He looked up at Lillian with eyes full of something more than instinct, something ancient, quiet, and knowing. Her son reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, holding it in both hands like an offering. He placed it gently in her palm, and when she looked down, she saw a worn leather dog tag, not the military kind, but the kind that belongs to a beloved pet. The edges were dulled, the letters slightly faded, but still legible. She brought it closer to her eyes, and her breath caught in her throat. The tag read, Milo, in memory of Thomas Hargrave, 1925 to 1973. You always found the lost. The world shifted in that moment, not in some grand, earth-shaking way, but like a ship that had finally come level after drifting off course. She looked from the tag to the dog, whose head now rested on her knee, and the truth arrived without trumpet or flash. Milo had never been just a dog. He had been the companion her late husband loved more than bourbon, the pup Thomas trained after returning broken from Korea, the one who'd slept at the foot of their bed through years of silence, years of loss, and the long goodbye of his illness. And when Thomas passed in the fall of '73, it was Milo who wouldn't leave his grave for 3 days, until Lillian finally came and whispered, "Come home." Only now, all those years later, she realized, the Milo walking beside her now wasn't the same dog. But he bore the same eyes, the same pace, the same quiet understanding. Her son spoke gently beside her. I tracked down every person you touched, every student, every soldier, every friend you lifted without ever keeping score. I followed your trail, not to bring you back, but to walk it with you, before time closed the door for good. Lillian bowed her head, a tear falling at last, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming grace of being known, truly known, before the light faded. Milo was Dad's, she whispered, the memory falling back into place like a puzzle piece long lost under the rug. He was, her son said, and maybe, just maybe, the part of Dad that still needed to finish something, found its way home through him. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the porch. Milo stood, walked a few steps forward, then turned to wait, like always. Lillian stood too, slowly, but without help, as if her bones remembered their purpose. Her son placed a gentle hand on her back and asked, one final time. Are you ready to go home, Mom? And Lillian, smiling through tears that no longer frightened her, said what she hadn't said in years, maybe decades. Yes. I remember the way. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.